In this video, I will dive into the several levels of U.S. law enforcement. I'm Nicholas, and this is the Law Enforcement Agency Information Channel. Law enforcement in the United States is a component of the government responsible for the enforcement of laws. The government, and therefore law enforcement, is divided into four levels: federal, state, county, and municipal. Um, the level of law enforcement that a law enforcement agency operates at determines a wide range of things, including its responsibilities, jurisdiction, requirements, training, report structure, and much more. In the United States, federal law enforcement is the level of law enforcement operating at the federal level. Since there is only one government operating at the federal level in the United States, just like most countries, the total amount of law enforcement agencies operating at the level is much smaller than that of other levels of law enforcement. Um, Federal law enforcement operates for not a municipality, not a county, not a state, but an entire country. Um, federal law the there are approximately 185 federal law enforcement agencies. The FBI being the primary, and the CBP being the largest. Um, each federal law enforcement agency has its own individual responsibilities and duties. Um, However, all federal law enforcement agencies share two things in common, and those two things are they are all responsible for enforcing federal laws. That's number one. And number two, they are all established uh, by Congress, and therefore derive their authority from the U.S. Code. Um, the federal law enforcement agencies are the only agencies. They are the only law enforcement agencies within the United States capable of making arrests anywhere within the United States. While not all federal law enforcement agencies have this authority, um, they are the only level of law enforcement that can make nationwide arrests. Anyways, the so basically, sorry, it's the jurisdiction. This brings me to the jurisdiction of federal law enforcement, which is basically there is no straightforward answer to the jurisdiction of federal law enforcement. The majority of federal law enforcement agencies have domestic wide jurisdiction. However, the jurisdiction of a federal law enforcement agency depends on a wide range of factors. The main factor is whether the agency is civilian staffed or military staffed. Basically, what I mean by that, well, I'll explain civilian and military federal law enforcement agencies later, but basically, the reason why that is civilian federal law enforcement agencies typically have uh, a very wide, typically they have the widest jurisdiction out of all branches of federal law enforcement. They are capable of enforcing federal laws throughout the United States. In other words, civilian federal law enforcement agencies have domestic wide jurisdiction. Military federal law enforcement agencies really vary because the majority of military federal law enforcement agencies are restricted to military property. However, specific there are a couple military federal law enforcement agencies that don't have that don't have that do have domestic wide jurisdiction. Um, those are usually agencies like the U.S. Coast Guard, military inspector generals like the U.S. Army Inspector General, and much more. Sorry if I'm not making sense here. I'm not that good at explaining. But yeah, that's really it for their main responsibilities and jurisdiction, and yeah. Federal law enforcement is divided into two branches: military and civilian. Civilian federal law enforcement is the civilian staff branch of federal law enforcement, as its name suggests. Its officers are known as federal officers. Um, Federal officers slash federal agents. It depends on whether the agency is investigative or uniformed. But anyways, civilian federal law enforcement has the broadest jurisdiction out of all federal law enforcement branches, with authority and jurisdiction throughout the United States and its territories. Civilian federal law enforcement is also the largest branch of federal law enforcement, with approximately 149 out of 185 federal law enforcement agencies being civilian staffed. Examples of civilian federal law enforcement agencies include the FBI, DEA, USMS, BOP, ATF, USAF, OSI, USACID, DOD, OIG, ICE, etc. Now I will go on to military federal law enforcement. So for military federal law enforcement is the military staffed branch of federal law enforcement. Military federal law enforcement officers military federal law enforcement officers are referred to as both federal officers and military personnel. So, military federal law enforcement, the jurisdiction of military federal law enforcement really depends on whether it is. The jurisdiction of military federal law enforcement really depends on the specific type of military federal law enforcement. So you see, there are specific types of military federal law enforcement, unlike civilian federal law enforcement, which there aren't really types of civilian federal law enforcement. But anyways, for military federal law enforcement, there are three types of military federal law enforcement. The first type is military police. So military police, or MPs for short, are military staff federal law enforcement agencies that are responsible for protecting military property, which includes military bases, military installations, etc. Military police have some of the most restrictive jurisdiction out of all federal law enforcement agencies, and there are a wide range of things that they are restricted on, not just jurisdiction. They are restricted on a lot of things, including jurisdiction, criminal investigations, civilian-related matters, and authority, and much more. Military police. There are currently 7 military police agencies. There are currently 6 military police agencies. Sorry about that. The 6 military police agencies are the U.S. Army Military Police, the U.S. Army Corrections Command, the U.S. Navy Military Police, the how you pronounce? No, sorry, it's not the U.S. Navy Military Police. I'm so sorry about that. It's the U.S. Navy Master at Arms. And added on top of that, there is also the U.S. Air Force Security Forces. Then there is the Marine Corps Military Police, and lastly, there is the U.S. Coast Guard Maritime Enforcement Specialists. Added on top of that, so now another type of military federal law enforcement is military inspector generals, which basically specialize in investigating corruption within the military. So just like normal inspector generals, they have the same exact duty, except they're investigating crimes within military branches, not civilian agencies. So military inspector generals, like I said, they investigate corruption and all that stuff within typically within, since there is it's typically within military branches, but more broadly military departments too, because technically it falls under military departments and not military branches. Sorry, I'll get over that later. But anyways, there are four military inspector generals: the U.S. Army, the Office of the Army Inspector General, the Office of the Air Force Inspector General, the Office of the Naval Inspector General, the Office of the Marine Corps Inspector General, and for the U.S. Coast Guard, they don't have an Inspector General. The Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General kind of fulfills that duty, but they are a military Inspector General. Anyways, added on top of military Inspector Generals, there is also maritime law enforcement, which is basically military staff, federal law enforcement agencies that specialize in that specialize in maritime enforcement on USCs. Now, realistically, there is only one maritime federal law enforcement agency. There is only one maritime federal law enforcement agency, and that is the U.S. Coast Guard. So you see, the U.S. Coast Guard, it actually has a much broader jurisdiction. That is why it is not, as many people commonly mistake, it is not military police of itself. It is actually, it's a very complicated thing, but is basically separate from military police. It is considered just maritime law enforcement. That is pretty much it for the staffing of federal law enforcement. The requirements to being a federal law enforcement agency are just like any other law enforcement agency. Usually, the requirements to being considered a law enforcement agency within the federal government are that obviously you must be a federal agency. You must be capable of enforcing federal laws. You must be capable of making arrests. And lastly, you must be capable of carrying firearms. Now, the individual powers of a federal law enforcement agency are determined by the U.S. Code, or more specifically, the people who make it, which is Congress. However, with this being said, federal law enforcement, not all agencies consider, not all people consider it the same way. What I mean by that is the Federal Law Enforcement Training Accreditation, which is basically a federal agency that accredits all federal law enforcement training, considers a federal agency as considers a federal law enforcement agency as any federal agency capable of enforcing federal laws. They don't care if you're capable. They don't care if you're capable of making arrests or carrying firearms. All they care about is whether you're a federal agency that is capable of enforcing federal laws. If you're that, you're considered a federal law enforcement agency. And the significance of this is that means agencies, federal agencies that are not usually considered federal law enforcement, like TSA, still have to go through training, since they are still federal agencies capable of enforcing federal laws. So therefore, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Accreditation considers them a federal law enforcement agency. So kind of sucks for TSA, but yeah, that's how it kind of goes. That's pretty much it for their the requirements to being a federal law enforcement agency. All federal law enforcement officers are required to complete a federal law enforcement training accreditation approved academy. The majority of federal law enforcement agencies train their officers at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. However, with that being said, not all do. Again, like I said, the majority do. 108, approximately 108 out of 185 federal law enforcement agencies train their officers at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Again, this is a rough estimate. Federal law enforcement agencies that don't train their officers at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center include the FBI, DEA, the U.S. Army Military Police, the U.S. Air Force Security Forces, the U.S. Marine Corps Military Police, the U.S. Navy Master at Arms, etc. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. In the United States, state law enforcement, also commonly but informally known as state police, is the level of law enforcement that operates at the state level. State law enforcement is funded and established by a state government. It is specifically funded and established by a state legislature, which is basically Congress except state level. The specific duties and responsibilities of a state law enforcement agency vary by agency. However, all state law enforcement agencies are collectively responsible for enforcing state laws in some form or way, whether that's through motor carrier enforcement, motor vehicle enforcement, fish and game enforcement, fire and arson enforcement, etc. They enforce state laws. California, out of all states, has the most state law enforcement agencies. Currently, they have approximately 23 state law enforcement agencies. So, yeah, it's a lot. As many people commonly mistake, the state police is not the only state law enforcement agency within a state. While the state police is absolutely a state law enforcement agency, it is not the only state law enforcement agency. Many people often refer to it because many people refer to the state police when talking about state law enforcement because of how big it is and how wide its jurisdiction and authority is. The state police, probably one of the main reasons is because the state police is the primary state law enforcement agency in the state. They are the officers you see patrolling in state trooper cars. But anyways, common mistakes that people make when when people often mistake this, they'll often say things like Hawaii doesn't have a state police agency. Now, that is not true. I'm using this as an example. Many people who don't know that the state police isn't the only state law enforcement agency within a state will say things like Hawaii doesn't have a state police agency when the actual answer or the actual thing is Hawaii does have a state police agency. In fact, it has multiple state police agencies. Um, what people should have said is that Hawaii doesn't have thus a primary state police agency, because that would center the focus to the actual state police agency of a state. Um, yeah, so that's pretty much it for the overview of state law enforcement. The jurisdiction of state law enforcement varies by agency. The majority of state law enforcement agencies have statewide jurisdiction throughout their respective state. However, with that being said, not all do. Typically, a state law enforcement agency will have statewide jurisdiction if its respective state uh, thinks it needs statewide jurisdiction. And what I mean by that is state governments, specifically state legislatures, uh, get to choose the jurisdiction of a state law enforcement agency when establishing them. Um, for example, in many states, in many states other than California, state university police officers won't have statewide jurisdiction. Um, this is simply because statewide jurisdiction, state university police officers don't really need statewide jurisdiction in order to get from campus to campus. There's really no need unless you're a state park ranger, or state police officer, or state fish and game warden, or whatever. You don't really need statewide jurisdiction. And as a state university police agency, they definitely don't really need statewide jurisdiction. However, like I said, California does allow it. California is like one of the very, very few states that actually does allow its university police office. That does allow its state university police officers to operate statewide. So, in conclusion, state law enforcement agencies don't need statewide jurisdiction in order to be considered a state law enforcement agency. They're still state law enforcement, they just don't have statewide jurisdiction. Remember, it's state level law enforcement, not statewide law enforcement. In the United States, county law enforcement is the level of law enforcement operating at the county level. County law enforcement officers are employed by their respective county, but funded by their respective state. County law enforcement, usually a county does not have more than one county law enforcement agency. The most common example of a county law enforcement agency would be a county sheriff's office. Um, County sheriff's offices are responsible for conducting the majority of county law enforcement duties within a county. Some counties have more than one county law enforcement agency. However, usually the majority of counties have only one county law enforcement agency. Um, However, counties like Los Angeles may have multiple. Um, sorry. The specific duties of a county law enforcement agency vary by agency. Typically, county law enforcement agencies, all county law enforcement agencies share two things in common, and that is they are all responsible for enforcing local and state laws, and they are all founded slash established by a state constitution. The jurisdiction of a county law enforcement agency varies by agency. However, the majority of county law enforcement agencies have county-wide jurisdiction. The likelihood that a county law enforcement agency will have county-wide jurisdiction is higher then the likelihood a state law enforcement agency will have statewide jurisdiction. Um, the jurisdiction of a county law enforcement agency is determined is determined by state laws. So yeah. In the United States, municipal law enforcement is the level of law enforcement operating at the municipal level, or in other words, under a municipal government. Municipal law enforcement agencies and county law enforcement agencies are the primary law enforcement agencies in the United States when it comes to policing. They Municipal law enforcement is also the largest level of law enforcement, with approximately 12,000 out of the entire 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States being municipal. The specific duties and responsibilities of municipal law enforcement varies by agency. However, they are all responsible for enforcing their responsibilities are always overlapping with enforcing local and state laws. They always regard that. Probably the most common example of a municipal law enforcement agency is a municipal police department. There are, of course, others, but usually a municipality does not have more than one municipal law enforcement agency, and that municipal law enforcement agency is almost always the municipal police department, since municipal police departments are the primary municipal law enforcement agencies, typically. New York City and Los Angeles have some of the most municipal law enforcement agencies out of all municipalities in the United States. That's pretty much it. The jurisdiction of a municipal law enforcement agency varies based upon local and state laws. Typically, municipal law enforcement agencies have citywide jurisdiction throughout their respective municipality. However, with that being said, not all do. The majority do, but not all do. The likelihood a municipal law enforcement agency will have citywide jurisdiction is typically higher than the likelihood a county law enforcement agency will have countywide jurisdiction. Municipal law enforcement has legal authority on municipally owned lands, which includes municipal roads, municipal sidewalks, municipal buildings, etc. Local law enforcement is a common term that refers to the primary law enforcement agencies when it comes to policing in the United States, which, like I mentioned earlier, are municipal and county law enforcement agencies. Some people, if not many people, also use the term local law enforcement instead of county and municipal law enforcement when referring to levels of law enforcement. However, I personally choose to keep municipal and county law enforcement as separate levels when referring to levels of law enforcement, since they technically are separate levels. So you see, while municipal and county law enforcement are very similar levels, they are completely separate when it comes to levels of law enforcement and government. In my opinion, in my honest opinion, it is informal to refer to county and municipal law enforcement as one level.